So I'll be talking today about Lora and its main protocol, LoRaWAN, exactly kind of what it is, how its security works, and also what we can actually do to try and test it. So to give sort of an introduction, for those of you who don't know me, so I'm a security consultant at MWR, security researcher as well, so some of the stuff I've done in the past has for several years involved Android security. If you look up Pwn to Own a couple of years ago, we got a winning entry in there. It scored a CV score, I think, of 2, so I'm actually kind of proud of such a low score managing to get through. These days I look at operational technologies, so that's looking at embedded systems, IoT, and industrial control systems. So back in November last year, we started looking at a number of industrial events. And these conferences weren't security conferences, they were just places where major vendors, so Siemens, Samsung, everyone in the kind of IoT space, the ICS space, could present their latest technology and the latest protocols they were using, the latest applications, services, everything that they had to offer. And we thought this was a great opportunity to go along and talk to them about this, and also try and get an understanding of what kind of new technologies are moving into this space so we can try and stay ahead of the curve. This particular event, the European Utility Week, is massive. Like hundreds and hundreds of vendors. Every vendor you can ever name had a stall there. Thousands of people were attending. Big event, and obviously we thought, well, okay, we're attending this, we need to kind of prepare. We need to be able to talk to the technical staff about the kind of protocols they're using, the kind of technology they're using. So, okay, let's have a look at the kind of protocols we expect to see in this kind of space. And these were our assumptions, the kind of things we would expect. Okay, we would expect, Zigbee to be used, these low power radio protocols, sort of maybe, using Bluetooth low energy, the kind of things you'd expect to see in sort of smart city devices, in PLCs and industrial systems. Unfortunately, when we actually arrived on the first day, I kind of got there and started speaking to everyone, and these names never came up. These protocols never came up. I think 1 or 2 were using Zigbee. Apart from that, these were all protocols that I had never heard of, and we had to run back to our rooms in the evening and just study up as best we can so we could go in the next day and actually talk to people about this. And there was actually quite an important reason behind why no one's using those particular protocols, or at least in this space they're not using those protocols. And you can kind of break it down like this. So we have our idea of, okay, if we want to send data over long range, over wireless, then, okay, we'll use cellular networks, or, we can use satellite communication. And if it's a little bit shorter, okay, we can maybe up the bandwidth a little bit, and then we can start using things like Wi-Fi, like Bluetooth. Now, recently, this space has emerged. So this is the kind of low power protocols that we saw on the previous slide, the Zigbee space, the Bluetooth low energy space. The kind of area where you're now running things on batteries, you can't really have things plugged into the mains anymore, so we have these protocols come in. But obviously there's a gap, and that's what's now being filled. So what we have in this gap is, well, what if you need things to run on batteries for years, but you still need for them to be able to transmit over a range of kilometers, not meters? So what we're looking at is this LPWAN. So LPWAN, talking about low power, wide area networks. Number of criteria that obviously we want if we're going to use these kind of technologies. Yes, they need to be low power, but seriously low power. We want to plug a battery in on our little device, put it out miles away, and this thing needs to run for years. Okay, it needs to be able to run for many kilometers, otherwise, well, we've got protocols that can handle short range. Okay, it's going to have a low bit rate because, you can't have everything. You're going to be low powered, you're going to have long range. We're not going to be able to send much, so the bandwidth has to be pretty narrow. This has become possible recently using one of several modulations, which I'll go through, but also it has to be cheap. We're going to mass produce hundreds of these devices, and they're going to be sent around, they're going to break, and people are going to tread on them or steal them. We need to be able to build these physical devices so that they're very, very cheap to make. The kind of places where you'll see LPWAN is a number of areas stand out and are actively being developed in. So in infrastructure, one of the big areas is the utility companies are very, very interested in being able to predict and detect things like low pressure in water pipes. So if they can not just wait for a customer to call and say, like, you know, my lawn's full of water now, like if they can actually detect this thing happening, then they'll be able to respond to it more effectively. Smart cities, so I've talked previously about places like Santander, which is a city in Spain doing a whole bunch of smart city research and actually applications, and they've managed to reduce, they claim they've reduced energy usage in their city by up to like 25%, so crazy actual benefits. They're doing things such as just really, really simple stuff like monitoring the amount of trash in their large trash cans, and then building up, okay, where's our garbage collection trucks? Where are they going to go through today? Because there's no point in them driving to an empty trash can. So again, this really makes sense to use LPWAN in that situation. And finally, logistics. People are worried about their containers, about their parcels being shipped around. Well, if you could put a tiny chip in it, now you can actually monitor it in real time. You know exactly where it is. You know the temperature of the reefer unit that you've put in your shipping container. So this is a really, really attractive space. It's attracting a huge amount of investment at the moment. And as a result, with any space, there's a number of competitors. Now, there's a number of ways of trying to achieve this idea of saving power and getting long range. So there's kind of three main sort of competitors in terms of modulation. First one is ultra narrowband. So this is the idea that if you use very, very narrow frequency shift keying, you can spin it to a narrow band, but you can get longer range for it. One area that's come up quite a lot and is fairly new, I think sort of autumn last year it really got announced, was that you could actually use current cellular networks and actually start building IoT on top of that. So this NB-IoT, or various companies have their own name for it, but you can actually build IoT modulation protocols on top of cellular networks. Finally, you have Lora, which is actually very, very wideband. So kind of three competing ideas. Now, there's a lot of companies getting involved in this that are putting their names to each of these. The big ones for ultra narrowband would be Sigfox, hugely invested, both in terms of the number of investors putting money into them and the amount of technology they're rolling out. MB, LTE, IoT, CIoT, companies like Huawei are pushing MBC IoT, companies like Orange pushing MB LTE. For Lora, there's one or two companies, but the biggest by far is the Lora Alliance, which is pushing their protocol on top. So as a result, you can kind of imagine we're in this kind of VHS versus Betamax kind of stage. There's a lot of people competing for the same space, all saying that their protocol's the best, the fastest, the cheapest, whatever. And as a result, there's a lot of companies kind of siding with one or the other. So if we look at the semiconductor manufacturers, they're actually kind of taking sides on this already. A lot of like announcements from these companies like, okay, we are supporting this area because we think it's the best. Atmel, Samsung, Silicon Labs, big investors into the Sigfox brand, cellular MBs, so using cellular networks. A lot of American companies, we'll see American telcos as well, really investing in that space. And then companies like Microchip are really siding with Lora and LoRaWAN. Telcos, I mentioned, I think you can imagine if you were a telco and you saw this whole new range of protocols coming out that doesn't use your network, you're going to kind of get a bit scared about it, or at least feel like you're kind of missing a piece of the action. So a lot of the telecoms companies are, again, investing and siding with this kind of technology. Their idea is they can start plugging this into their existing infrastructure and offer this as a service. So again, you can see cellular MB, a lot of the American companies, or T-Systems as well. A lot of European telecoms companies are actually South Korea Telecom as well with LoRaWAN, and then various other companies again with Sigfox. So why did I choose Lora? We could go off and research any of the others. I think Sigfox would make an amazing piece of research if anyone can do it. I've run into a lot of people saying I'd have to sign NDAs before I can see the spec, so that kind of put me off looking at Sigfox because obviously I wouldn't be able to talk about it. The nice thing about LoRaWAN is it's actually open source. Anyone today can just go to Lora's website and download it and get the full specification, the protocol stack, all the security, and the guidance for how to install it and implement it. It's not just theory. I'll show you a slide in a moment of a city that's already rolled it out, but there's a number of companies. Orange in France, for instance, is rolling it out in something like 16 cities. It already has LoRa infrastructure out there. Recently, they also pushed out these kind of smart lamps to their employees that would actually become these kind of gateways for Lora that employees were expected to put in their own homes. That's okay, interesting. Also, the uses, I think, make this an interesting area for research. We're not talking about smart fridges here or bins per se. I don't care if someone knows what's in my fridge or how often I flush my toilet. But they are being used for things that I think have a safety and security impact. It's already being talked about for, hey, we could automate train level crossings with this kit. You know, we can build, I've already seen one instance where someone's designed a burglar alarm system. And a number of industrial control systems as well. So if we can look at this area and find security findings, then obviously that would have genuine impact. The other thing was from the conference itself, and on day one I was going up to people and saying, what protocol do you use, and how does the security work on that? And the response I got, and obviously the sales staff had just been taught this one line to say when people ask, oh, don't worry, it uses AES-128 encryption. Right, okay, yeah, thanks, I feel much more comfortable. So I started going up to them and saying, well, okay, apart from AES-128 encryption, how does security work on your product? And that the stunned silence would follow because I've just used their only line. And that was kind of good indication to me that this is worth looking into. And as I said, if you want to go to that website, you can download the spec now to actually see all the security features. So my role as a consultant, as a researcher, means I'm going to get clients come up to me and say, we were thinking of doing this crazy idea with this thing that no one's ever thought of before. How safe is that? And it's I can't exactly say, oh, it's got AES-128, you're fine. That's a terrible answer. So I need to understand it well enough to be able to explain, well, you could do this, but be careful, and this would be the repercussions. Similarly, companies might be saying, well, we've got these two products, both say they use Lora and LoRaWAN. That's which one should we choose? So there's kind of a due diligence angle on this as well that we need to think about. So the research from November to now, and this is what I'll be presenting for the rest of this talk, was kind of finding the following goals. So is it even possible? Is this whole thing a whole stack of cards which is thinly veiled, which is going to fall apart when you try and use it, or is it actually very good? Then to go from there and say, well, if you are going to use it, what do you need to worry about? And finally, if you've designed something, how do you test? How do you know what you've produced is secure or insecure? How do you go about finding vulnerabilities in this, which, you know, given that there aren't any tools or anything out there to explain how to do this. So this is the process we followed. We've got the specification, great, let's have a good read through from a security point of view. I'm not affiliated with Lora, I'm completely independent, so, you know, I can try and offer an independent view. And we'll actually go and grab some real life stuff, what people are actually using it for. And then from that we can put that all into a paper, and that's what we've done. And produce tools where there currently aren't any testing tools, so that other people can then go out and actually, you know, prove or disprove the security of these products. So we can't just dive straight into security. We need to know what the hell Lora is and what LoRaWAN is. We know it's a low power wide area network, but let's dive into a bit more detail. So Lora, when I'm talking about Lora, that's the PHY layer. That's the radio modulation. LoRaWAN is the MAC layer, so the protocol sat on top. Lora, the modulation itself is actually owned by Semtech. They've patented it, but they'll actually license it out to other vendors. As far as I know, Semtech are the only people with the official kit that's been through all the testing yet, but I'm expecting other manufacturers to come along soon and offer alternatives. The LoRaWAN spec is entirely open. Anyone can go and build a product tomorrow using that and doesn't have to worry about licensing, because it's pretty attractive, and that's quite a different model to a lot of its competitors. Now let's actually have a look at how this thing exists. It's going to somehow run across a city, it's going to be wireless, and it's going to be secure. Okay, so there's three components. First of all, you're going to have nodes. I'm going to grab one now. Somewhere. There it is. Okay. So this is a node. This is actually a European one, which is sadly why there's no demos today, because the ISM band is different for each region. So this is the European, runs on 868 megahertz. They're pretty cheap and easy. The idea is this is just a transceiver, but you plug it into some kind of microcontroller or other kit, so into a Raspberry Pi, into an Arduino, whatever you want to use. But these nodes are going to be the very low power part. They're going to be the ones scattered across the city, very cheap, numerous of them, and they're going to use this LoRaWAN protocol to speak back to home. So next you're going to have gateways. So this is a gateway made by Multitech. Fewer of them, they're actually powered, and you need enough to cover the city so that the nodes can talk back to these gateways. Range of these nodes talk to the gateways is in kilometers. People have said anything from a couple of kilometers up to about 15 kilometers, depending on buildings and other kind of noise in the way. So nodes will be talking back to gateways. Finally, you'll have your very sort of traditional, we're all used to it, our IT network that obviously somehow deals with this data. So the spec talks about having a network server, but there'll also be some kind of, or one or more application servers sat in the background. So the network servers talking to the gateways, that'll be very, very traditional, normal technology, so either some kind of long Ethernet kind of network, or maybe if the gateways are spread out around a city, give them some kind of 3G dongle so that they can talk back to the network server. The gateways to the nodes will be using these LoRa broadcasts. So the idea is this node just sends out its broadcast message, and because it's in range of a gateway, that'll get picked up. It might hit 2 gateways, but hopefully the network server's smart enough to actually pick up the message and know it came from a single node. Nodes have to be pretty low powered, obviously, that's kind of the point of them. So they can't be listening the whole time. Or if they do, that's going to take up a lot of power. So the standard way for them to work is in a call and reply kind of way. So the node will broadcast, gateway will pick it up, funnel it through to the network server, and the node will have a number of listening windows, very, very short and brief, that the network server knows about. So the network server, if it wants to send a reply, has that window. So by standard, the network servers can't talk to the nodes unless they're replying to a message. The gateways in all of this, as you can see, are completely dumb devices. They just proxy the traffic through, they don't parse it, they don't look at it, other than to make sure it was to them and not a rival company's gateway. Now I said the gateways have pretty good range, so this is German city of München, pretty big city, and obviously the red dots here are the gateways. So they've put 6 gateways that's covered most of the city, certainly the eastern side. As you can see, the sort of center of the city and the western part, because obviously bigger buildings, more noise, lower coverage, but as soon as you get out to sort of outside the city, suddenly the coverage gets very, very good. But they've essentially covered an entire city using just 6 gateways, so you can throw a whole number of nodes in there and be comfortable that they'd be able to communicate back to home. So that's the basics. That's the only components that really make up a LoRa network. But let's sort of think about attack vectors. Now, this is a mess. This is incredibly complex. This isn't just our normal little comfy Windows domain. We've now got multiple protocols. Some of them are wireless. We've no idea what this gateway to network server might look like. The nodes themselves, should we worry about that? And this is where the research was kind of, I thought, the main value of it, because the specification might tell you how it could work, but how on earth do we go about testing this thing? Like, the number of attack vectors you've got here is huge. How do you prioritize? How do you actually work out what you need to test? So for security, everything works on these symmetric keys. So you'll have a network session key and an application session key. So the application session key here is in red, network session key here is in blue. Now, when the node wants to talk, it will encrypt. So it wants to talk to the application server, it will encrypt using the application session key in red and sign using the network session key in blue. So as the message goes through, the network server can check, yes, the entire packet is signed, no one's manipulated that message, and it can't decrypt the message, which is quite nice. You can have this kind of split thing where maybe other companies own the application servers. The payload of that message goes through to the application server where it's got the other key, so it's able to decrypt and maybe encrypt a reply, and the same process works in reverse. There may be other situations where the network server needs to manage these nodes. Hey, we need to change channel. Hey, we need to change our spread factor because there's too much noise around here. At that point, they would use a command message, and that can be another thing injected into the packet. Of course, the network server has only got one of those keys, so it's now going to encrypt and sign using this network session key. Joining a network's fairly complicated. Imagine you are now a water utility, you want to roll this thing out, or you've rolled it out and after 6 months a couple of these things have broken. How do you put a new node into this network? So the first option, pretty obvious. You've got hold of all these nodes before you ship them out, put all the keys straight on those nodes. Keys should be unique per node, so you need to worry about how exactly you're going to sort of provision these keys and keep them safe. But this is just called activation by personalization. Put all the keys on the node before you ship them out. They start up, they start talking, everyone's happy. The other option, a bit more complicated, is over-the-air activation. Now at this point, the nodes are sent out knowing which application ID they are, they've got a device ID, and they've got a sort of temporary application key, again, unique per node. So we got to worry a little bit because these nodes now need to somehow get this network session key and application session key without Gman being able to detect it. So here's Gman trying to listen, and we've got our node somehow needing to talk to our server. So the node first sends a join request message. This join request message has the unique app ID, unique device ID, so the node specific ID, and a nonce generated by the node. Not encrypted, but signed with an application key. So the server can now use that information, generate its own nonce, and derive what the session keys should be from this. So what the application network server should do, obviously, is first check that that signature is valid, check the state of that node. Didn't it just join 5 minutes ago? Has it never joined before? Should it be joining now? And if it's comfortable, then it needs to go ahead and generate these session keys. This is the formula it's using, so it's going to take the application key, because obviously it knows it as well, use the device's nonce that was sent over, generate its own nonce, and use this formula to generate the 2 keys that it will then use for the rest of its time. It then replies to say, yes, that's fine, you can join, that was all good, I've generated the keys now. It doesn't send the keys itself, but it can now send its own nonce back to the node, and it encrypts it with the application key. So again, Gman listening in the middle doesn't have that app key, can't tell what that message is, can't tell what the nonce is, therefore can't generate the 2 session keys. The node can, because it has that information. So Gman's left completely stuck, unable to decipher, decrypt, get the keys, do anything, but the node's managed to join safely. So messaging itself, obviously again, we're worried about this broadcast of potentially sensitive information. So we're going to use these session keys as described previously to encrypt and sign. For application, okay, we're going to use both keys, but for command messages, we're just using the network session key. Okay, let's dive into the maths a bit more. When people say they're going to use AES-128 encryption for these messages, what they actually mean is they're using it in counter mode to generate a key stream. So for each message that the node wants to send, it's going to use this formula, essentially take a whole bunch of data, including, importantly, a couple of counters, basically how many messages have I sent, and encrypt that with the key in a for loop that just keeps incrementing the I value on the end, and generates a nice long key stream. The idea that this key stream can be regenerated by the server, because it has all this information, and should be unique for every single message that gets sent. It then just XORs that with the payload and can send it on safely. So the MAC payload there, so the FRM payload, that's what we're worried about. That's our application's data, whatever it's sending, probably something that we want to keep safe. We're going to XOR that with the key stream, put it in our MAC payload, and the MAC payload goes into the PHY payload, and the MIC, the message integrity check, is the signature. So only the payload gets encrypted, but the whole message gets signed. So we talked about the basics. That's all there is to the security, really. There's an extra option, though, for what's called Class B. They call it Class B networks, but I'll call it Class B systems because it's got nothing to do with our sort of traditional definition of a Class B network. If you want added functionality, once all these nodes are set up, you can upgrade the whole system to a Class B. Class B counters a couple of extra options. What if one of the nodes is moving constantly between gateways? Quite possible we could put it in a container. That could be a problem. And what if the network server needs to talk to the node? Well, it either has to wait for a day, a week, a month for the node to talk to it and reply. That might not be effective for the solution that you're trying to build. So once we decide, okay, we want a Class B system. To help do this, there's a couple of extra functions. The gateways, previously just dumb, passing everything forward, now have a function. They're going to start broadcasting this kind of information that's going to include the gateway's GPS location and a timestamp. So the node can now look at this information and decide, oh, I've moved gateways. Okay, I'll send an update to the network server. Or it could be using that time information to say, okay, that's the network's time. That's the official time of this network. I'll set my internal time to that to match. They can then use that time to open these listening windows in sort of a way that the network server is also aware of. So now the network server knows, okay, every minute, every hour, it's going to be listening, so I can now send a message first. It also allows the ability for the network server, whereas previously you would need to encrypt using each node's independent key, now you can send a multicast message to all the nodes at once. A useful feature. So that's kind of it. Either you have this very simple Class A system, which is this call reply using these keys to encrypt, or you can upgrade to a Class B system. And that's as far as the spec really goes in saying what you should be doing, what there is. So this is kind of where the research starts. Well, how secure is this? What attacks could we actually be trying against these systems? How do we test that it's secure? Now those lovely simple diagrams are wonderful, 3 components, they all talk to each other, that's nice, that's safe. Chances are this is going to be a mess. You know that network server is going to be on a flat network talking to 1,000 other systems, and the database is off somewhere else, and it's going to be pretty complicated. So let's have a look at actually trying to test these systems. Okay, first of all, messaging. Now what you have to remember is even though the specification says this is how things work, what they actually mean is this is how you should implement your system. So as a developer, this is entirely up to you. Most of these security features are implied that you should be doing them. So imagine the decryption is performed before the mix checked. What would happen? Similarly, let's say for some reason the counters aren't incremented, or that the counters are somehow reset. Or let's say for some reason you decide that generating unique session keys is too difficult. Let's just base it on the MAC address, or whatever the equivalent is. So if decryption is performed before the MIC is checked, well, that actually opens up a couple of attacks to us. Now, the fact that the key stream is being generated and you XOR it with the plain text means we know exactly which bytes correspond to which parts of the message. So if we know from our own investigations that maybe it's using some kind of format like this where it's sending the temperature and the ID, we don't know the key, but we know which bytes of the ciphertext correspond. So if we were to swap out, in this case, a 5D to a 5A, well, look, I've just changed the temperature without knowing the key. Okay, the MIC should obviously catch that because now I've corrupted and the signatures won't match. But if you're doing this checking the wrong way around, then that's going to cause a problem. F-count manipulation is quite an interesting one. That should be handled by the transceiver, like the component that's just separate, don't worry about it. According to the specification, they should always increment, and there should be no way of resetting a node. So if for some reason I am able to send a message with the maximum value of an F-count, well, now I've just bricked the node. There's no way you can send an extra message because the F-count would be lower, so it would just ignore the message. There's the other issue is if the F-count isn't being incremented, then that's one of the factors that's making sure the key stream is unique for every single message for each node. If we end up in a situation where we could maybe reset the node, so the F-count drops back to 0, but it keeps using the same key, then it means we're going to start duplicating our key stream and gives us a chance to actually try and work out what the payloads are because they're being XORed. So if you know the plain text of one, it's being XORed with a key stream, you know it's used the same key stream twice, therefore you can XOR it out to work out what the plain text of the other message must have been. Pretty obvious, but this is a flaw in using symmetric keys, is that you have to worry about what would happen if one of these keys was to be compromised. We'll go into a number of ways where you can get the keys out, but essentially if you're duplicating those keys everywhere, you're raising the fallout of a key being compromised. So if you compromise one key when everything's working correctly, then okay, you're going to start being able to both encrypt and decrypt traffic from both sides. So you can start spoofing messages, sniffing messages. If people are sharing keys, then obviously it expands to the whole network. That's a problem for network session keys because this can actually start sending command messages, and at that point you only need one of the keys to start sending that because it's using it for both encryption and signing. Now these MAC-only messages, these things that the network server is sending to update and keep the nodes using the right channels and everything, can include things like, okay, just give me a status, but it can do more sensitive things like, okay, let's change the channel, let's change the frequency. Obviously, if an attacker can send that, knock all the nodes to a wrong channel, suddenly nothing can talk to each other anymore, and if that's a railway crossing system, then that's a massive issue. Interestingly, at the bottom, the spec also allows proprietary messages. So again, entirely up to the vendor what they're doing. But again, if these keys are to be compromised, then obviously you can start sending proprietary messages. So is this a big issue because we need to steal the keys somehow? Well, it depends what network you're looking at. Because I think a lot of vendors don't realize the value of that network key. They assume you need both. Well, for command messages, no, you don't. You just need the one. So the Things Network is a sort of an IoT developer hub, so probably I'm hoping no one's doing anything security relevant on it because the website gives you the network session key so that you can join their network. You deal with the app key, but nothing stopping you war driving and to a 15-kilometer range, knocking over every node to a wrong channel or sending proprietary messages, whatever they might be. So in that case, the attacker could do all of these things. For over-the-air activation, a number of other things we need to be looking at. Obviously, the key should not be guessable. The spec is very, very clear on please don't use guessable or the same values, but entirely up to the developers, and we've seen in the past they don't always follow those rules, so they shouldn't be guessable. Just an interesting one as well, that nowhere in the spec does it say you should be monitoring the state of that node. So if you suddenly get another join request, are you checking for that, or what would you do? Just generate another key, override the keys of that node again? A couple of problems. Key management, okay, pretty obvious, but I think people again overlook this. Everyone's very worried about the node or very worried about the radio protocol. What we haven't noticed is there's now a server sat in our company that if someone was to crypto locker, we are seriously in trouble because that server, that database contains all the keys that we need to be able to communicate to these nodes. So it's a single point of failure potentially. So obviously pretty basic stuff. I think we're all comfortable here. Who's got access to that server? Just again, sort of least privileges, and even just stuff like basic things like if anyone's ever started their own DHCP server on a corporate network, never do that. That doesn't make people happy. But again, what if that server was to just randomly get knocked over or change its IP address? Big issue for everyone. Symmetric keys means they're going to be in two places, means they're going to be in the nodes. So we need to have a look at it. So this is what a node might look like. So this is the transceiver, so everything's sat on that half, but we're probably going to have a UART connection back to our microcontroller or microprocessor that's actually going to be doing all the dog's body work. So the keys themselves are going to be stored in the LoRaWAN transceiver, and the microcontroller can say, actually, please use this key. What it shouldn't be able to do is, please give me the key. So hopefully they are unique per node, but how secure are these actual transceivers at the moment? Well, this is the one I've got here. So it's using the microchips transceiver that we know has got the keys in it. Can we get the keys out? So if we could actually steal these nodes, and let's face it, they're going to be around our city, so yes, we could. Could we steal the keys out of the node? Could we steal the firmware out of the node and actually try and attack the ability to find maybe a parsing bug in there? That would be far more valuable. So we've got physical access. Can't we just grab onto one of the debug interfaces? Well, let's strip the shield off and have a look underneath. So that's a PIC chip sat underneath. 18LF, pretty good data sheets online for its debug interfaces. Horrible pins. I wouldn't recommend trying to solder on there. We did manage to. We spent all afternoon soldering onto it, only to find that the debug pins were actually exported onto a massive debug interface, and we could just plug a PicKit 3 onto it and just start querying it. So we were having a look at the flags, just using the programmer environment that's available for free. And okay, they've done a pretty good job. They've set all the code protection blocks to write only, so we can't read out. Interestingly, page reads are allowed, and you can write. So very interesting future research for anyone who fancies it. I reckon it's possible to write to one of those code blocks and then use page reads to read out the rest. So if you write to 2 different code blocks and your code starts executing, you should be able to dump the firmware. So another one, side channel. I'm sure most people have looked at power analysis or DPA. There's nothing in the PIC chip to say that it has a secure encryption area. It could be using a library that's designed to protect against side channel analysis, but that's again another area we should look at. But that's pretty hardcore complicated. Let's just go for something far more simple. If the microcontroller can send data that the LoRaWAN transceiver then encrypts for us, well, let's just replace the microcontroller. So at this point, we're now just proxying our data through. It's being encrypted and signed for us. Lovely. Okay, that's pretty easy. So now we can just start trying to send data straight through to that application server, and who knows, maybe cross-site scripting, SQL injection, parsing bugs, everything else. Certainly if that thing's doing things like our billing, then we can start definitely saying, I've used no power this month, don't worry about it. So we need to worry that the attacker has physical access to these devices. And that means that likely they can recover the keys if they were really that interested, or certainly be able to send data through it. So we can't really trust the data. Internet-facing components, okay, pretty obvious. If you've got a network server and some gateways, more likely it's going to look something like that. So you'll be using, a bunch of 3G dongles plugged into the gateways and some internet-facing web service for the network server. Certainly that's how a number of components do it. That gives us complete access to the web server, and every nefarious person out on the internet as well can start sending messages to it. So we're worried about a DDoS. I mean, that's, again, could just knock over our network server, and at that point, no more communication. It also allows us to start brute forcing to a higher degree. So the signing itself is 4 bytes. So if you really did want to try and just brute force, probably fairly possible. Okay, let's say 2 billion messages we would have to send to it to likely luck upon the correct MIC for a message. But, if you're not looking out for errors, I've got time. So the correct way you probably should do it is just use an APN, which is actually set up to use username password, but also you can whitelist by IMSI to at least keep that web server a little bit at bay, or at least maybe any admin services you've got on those 3G dongles, and then VPN across as well. So that way, hopefully, and don't VPN into the whole network, please. So, VPN so that you can see the web service, probably the easiest way of doing it. Class B is where it gets really interesting, because at this point we actually lose encryption. So we're worried about a couple of points with Class B networks. First of all, this multicast means that everyone must use the same key to be able to receive these multicast messages. So we've just lost quite an important security feature. Secondly, really important, those gateway beacons, the things with GPS and time that everything's then relying on, aren't encrypted or signed. So the specification says, okay, first of all, those multicast messages, you are on your own. Like, how you're going to set them up and use them, that's entirely up to you to figure out how to do that safely. Secondly, we don't even trust them. Don't send MAC commands across multicast messages, please, because they're not as secure. So basically, Class B, be careful. A loss of a shared key now, that side channel attack against a node, now has a real impact. You're not just attacking your home meter, you're attacking everyone on that networks. The only way I can imagine doing that is somehow you're going to keep switching keys, so you're using your private keys and messaging, and then when you're listening for a multicast, you send the multicast key across, at which point the microcontroller is now storing and saving 5 keys. So, yeah, be careful. Gateway beacons. Okay, first of all, if that gateway has a 3G dongle or some kind of way of connecting back to that network server that gives it privileged access, it's out there in the city, and it's now broadcasting its own GPS coordinates. So that's a pretty good win for an attacker. I'm just going to go wall driving till I see one and then go rip it off the wall. It can also send network-specific broadcasts. So again, entirely up to you, the developer, if you want to add some new features onto that, but be aware, neither encrypted nor signed. And finally, that if the nodes are using these for timing, and it doesn't say in the spec that that's what you should do, but looking on the forums, that is what developers are doing. They're setting the system time of all those nodes to be whatever's broadcast from the gateway, or more specifically, whatever they perceive as being broadcast from the gateway. So possible interesting attacks from that. So, it's quite a lot there. My summary after reading through all of this is it's perfectly possible to build a secure LoRa system. But it's not, as the salesmen are saying, it's not guaranteed because you're using LoRa, it's therefore secure. Quite the opposite. You need to know exactly what these attacks are, what the threats are, and actually what you can do to protect against it. That was 45 minutes-ish, which is obviously a complete blitz through. So what we've done is put all of this into a white paper. I think we're launching it tomorrow, but it'll be free to download from our website. So that'll be something that goes through all of this in far more detail, walks through the actual attacks, defenses, and test cases. Did mention there was a tool. Unfortunately, my programming is so bad, I don't think MWR would ever let me put this on their website. It's using Python, binaries, shared objects, SQL, JSON for a web front end. It works. I wouldn't recommend hosting it online. But it's got to the point now, if anyone wants a copy of it, you can have it, but I won't be publishing it just yet. What it lets you do, it uses a LoRa gateway, which is this. So you can just buy these. These are basically LoRa sniffers. Gateways have to, by definition, sniff all the traffic. So I've used one, just set it up so it just records all the traffic, then stores it in an SQLite database, and then you can actually see these messages. So these are LoRa packets. Clicking on one then gives you everything that you can read that isn't encrypted. So I now know which channel it's broadcasting on, I know which network it's relating to, I know the node's ID. It then lets you actually try the keys. So if you do know the network session key, you can just type it in, or the app session key rather. And in this case, it's managed to decrypt it for us. That's everything. I guess if there's any questions.
Questions, anyone?
So for the block ciphers, when they encrypt messages, did you say they're not using any signatures?
I'm sorry, for which ciphers?
So when they encrypt those messages, you showed that they're using AES encryption, and you said you can fake those, take a block and then just sort of replace it with, a different hex value. Did you say they're not using any signatures for that?
They are using signatures.
They are.
So then you use the network key to do an AES HMAC.
Yeah.
And you sign the whole thing. But again, it's up to the developer to actually check those and check before you start decrypting them.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else? Any more questions? No? Okay, thanks. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.